live alone.
The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewery on historic Bridge Street in Waco.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
Welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. We have an old friend of the program on. We're actually in the fourth year of doing this podcast. And so Ken Hafertepe, Dr. Ken Hafertepe, I won't call him a local treasure because that sounds like he needs to be buried. But
good.
Ken has contributed a lot to the local community and is well known in his field of museum studies, but also is well published and well recognized in the museum community and the historical community in Texas and beyond. So thanks, Ken, for coming back on with me.
My pleasure.
I want to recommend the original podcast that actually Randy and I did with Ken way back when, which was Historic Homes of Waco, Texas, which was Ken's first book. Not his first book, but his first book on Waco homes. The book that we're going to talk about today, which is very fitting, and I'll tell you why here in just a second, is Historic Buildings of Waco, Texas, which just came out, and then put on your Christmas list for maybe next year or this year. More Historic Homes of Waco, Texas, which is a follow-up. Will that come out in 24?
That should be February of 24.
February 24. So Historic Buildings of Waco, Texas is appropriate right now because we are on what is named the 21st floor, although it's really the 20th floor, right, Ken? Because there was no 13th. I didn't see a 13th coming up. But we are in the Alico building. We are a couple hundred feet up in the Alico building. So I want to start, Ken, with the structural integrity of this building. Should I be worried?
I think you're in pretty good standing. This was an ultra-modern building when it went up, which is to say it has a steel frame, and then the walls are actually a veneer of brick, which is good for keeping out weather, be that rain or heat or whatever. But it was quite a statement for Waco in the early 20th century. And the thing that I enjoyed most was seeing the original architect's drawings for the building, which are at University of Texas at the Alexander Architectural Archive. They have a collection of the drawings of Sanguinet and Statz of Fort Worth, who were the principal designers of the building. And they were actually just getting started in what turned out to be a dominant career as skyscraper designers in Texas. They did skyscrapers in Austin, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, and some in their home base of Fort Worth. So Wacoans were they were actually kind of on the early adopter side in terms of hiring Sanguinet and Statz. But if you've ever been to Sundance Square in Fort Worth, the Burke Burnett building there is the slightly younger sister of this building.
Okay.
And has been very nicely restored, I might say.
Yeah, that's a beautiful building. So this is the oldest historic skyscraper in Texas left, right? I've heard someone boast that before.
I've never really thought that entirely through. Almost exactly the same time in Austin, you get the Littlefield building at 6th and Congress, and Sanguinet Statz were right across the street with the Scarborough building. I mean, it's mighty close.
Yeah. So 1910 is the start date, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's an interesting story, especially because Marshall R. Sanguinet, who was the senior member of the firm, had worked for the San Antonio architect J. Riley Gordon on a number of his courthouses, including the one up in Waxahachie, which may be Gordon's masterpiece. And Gordon went on to design the McLennan County Courthouse here. Mm-hmm. So it's I always find it fascinating seeing the connections of different architects, where Wacoans went to get their architects, because they just weren't most of the time they were happy to employ local architects. But for certain types of buildings like skyscrapers, you wanted an expert from the outside. At the same time, you also needed to have someone who was in Waco and able to be watching over the project on a day-to-day basis, which is why Roy E. Lane was involved. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you hear that, he was the actual designer of the building. And having seen the drawings, I can tell you exactly who the people drawing all of the design were, and they were all draftsmen for Sanguinet and Stats.
I see.
But interestingly enough, Roy Lane is listed as associate architect. It's in a way that makes it clear that they really valued his contribution to it. That a lot of times you can kind of get lost way down on the cornerstone or whatever. And Lane was a very new professional at this point, younger than either Sanguinet or Stats, and it was actually probably a good gig for him to be overseeing this monumental project.
Yeah, and done in about a year.
Yes,
which is still makes my head spin. That
yeah, it's quite remarkable, and getting the steel frame up is really kind of the critical thing there. And one thing that I try to de-emphasize is the quaintness of the past, and that a Victorian house may look quaint and frilly to us, but to William Cameron in 1879, he's buying the latest thing.
Yeah,
and that the same thing was true here. That this was an attempt to make the statement that Waco is a progressive, forward-looking city. Progressive, not in the political sense, yeah, but in terms of eager to grow, eager to become a modern metropolis. And interestingly enough, it probably anticipated that there would be a lot more buildings like this around that didn't actually happen. As we're looking down on all of the buildings.
Yeah, we have a good view up here. We can kind of see everything because it's unobstructed.
I think this is about half of the buildings that are in the book.
Yeah. I mean, you could see most of them. Well, you started getting into some things you talk about in the introduction, kind of an overview and thinking about architectural designs, styles for different buildings, kind of eras of building, of kind of Waco buildings. And that, again, your definition of a building is anything that's not a house, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And that actually, I struggled with that. What do you call it? Because, in fact, a house is a building as well. But that actually goes back, that kind of distinction, in my memory at least. My old professor at UT, Drury Blakely Alexander, did a book, Texas Homes of the 19th Century, which was in conjunction with an exhibit at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth. And then the follow-up book to that, which covered all of the other building types, was Texas Public Buildings of the 19th Century by Willard B. Robinson of Texas Tech. So that just seems to be the simplest way of describing it. Although really, the public aspect of it too is the thing too that was useful in Willard Robinson's text. But yeah, that's how that came about.
Okay. Well, I want to ask Ken, you're a busy professional. You're doing all sorts of different things. I think we talked in the first podcast about kind of your motivations for doing that work and the timing of doing that work. I guess I'd like to ask you, now that you're past the midpoint, we'll say, just kind of your thoughts on doing this, maybe the decision to do the buildings book and not go straight to the extension with additional homes and that sort of thing. How's this been? How's it been received? Those questions.
Well, in terms of why buildings first, I think that it seemed to be the natural follow-up to historic homes. And what I learned as I was doing it is that there were still a lot of interesting homes that hadn't made it into the first historic homes book, where really there were 120 and you had to stop somewhere. But as I kept reading and digging into more archival sources, it just became clear that there were a lot of other interesting houses that could be included. That being said, it was pretty clear that there needed to be the public building side done as well. That as had been the case with Waco houses, there was sometimes confusion about who the architects were or who was really contributing the design and things of that nature. And some things that had just never been discussed at all. So you just drive by this old building and wonder, well, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
And so there's the answer to a lot of those what the heck questions in this volume.
Well, I would imagine you driving through the Waco landscape now. Maybe you know too much.
True. Yes. Time to bury some of those secrets. I don't know if I've said this out loud before, so I'll tell you and our listeners that the idea behind historic buildings, historic homes actually, was the idea of combining a windshield tour with an architectural guidebook and a little bit of a traditional architectural history. A guidebook would be arranged by geography so that you could go by, drive down a street and see what's around. And so it wasn't one of the typical things, but I wanted it to be that way, especially because a lot of things I was discovering just by driving around and saying, I wonder what the heck. That building looks old and interesting. What's the story with that? And so that was actually how a lot of the houses of historic Black Wacoans were discovered, and that was kind of a struggle. Because of the roadblocks and barriers that Black Wacoans faced, a lot of their homes were smaller and not as expensively built, and so they don't necessarily survive to the same rate, which was actually true even for Waco's Black ministers. But once I got beyond that, just driving around, for example, in the area around the old Paul Quinn College, it turns out that there are houses of Black Wacoans who worked in a variety of capacities, either at Paul Quinn or in support, or even parents of Paul Quinn students. And so that was so that was going in with the intentional notion of looking for a part of Waco that had not been discussed before, but also the critical thing was what was there that was left. So out of that, there are many houses in the first volume that were houses of middle class to upper middle class white people. It was not, there's sort of a notion of East Waco as being the black side of town, which is confused in a couple of senses. The most important part of historically Black Waco is the area, Waco North, of Waco Drive, and the area where New Hope Baptist Church is. And then a secondary, and also very important, was in East Waco, or in the area around Paul Quinn, which came there at a pretty early date. So there are multiple areas, but people don't realize the importance of the North Waco Black neighborhood because it was so badly erased by urban renewal. So that's one of the challenges that you face in writing a book like this. But the whole idea too was for both of these books to write about buildings that you can see and drive by, maybe go inside, and that is in a way, you could say it's aimed for a tourist market of people who are curious about Waco coming for the first time. But, in a lot of the feedback that I've gotten on both books, a lot of people who are lifelong Wacoans are pleasantly surprised to see the city's historic buildings being taken seriously
Yeah.
and studied. And so that's kind of gratifying, and people being astonished that the entire city was not demolished by the 1953 tornado.
Yeah.
Which was definitely not the case. So the irony is basing the book on extant buildings, which of course allows for my glorious color photographs too. If I may put in a plug.
And it doesn't say photo credit below every photo, which it
No,
should.
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that was an aesthetic decision on the part of Texas A&M Press. But yeah, I don't even know if it's on the title page, to tell you the truth.
I don't think it tells
Just
us
sort of flipping.
who took the pictures.
I'm so modest. It's all I can say as far as that. Yep. It doesn't say words by Kenneth Hafertepe either. So it's the whole darn thing. But the one thing that I don't like about that decision that I made was that basically it's one and done for each building.
Sure.
And so and it's a current view, as nice a view as I can make it, and I try very hard to eliminate things that are not of the period of the building when taking the photograph. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But the other thing that I feel like I tied my own hands was that it doesn't allow for historic photos or architects' drawings. And there's a wonderful set of drawings of the Alico building. And so, it is what it is, but it actually still leaves an opening for someone else down the line to do an additional book on Waco.
Yeah, but Ken, I think what you've done, if you would have gone in, I know your expertise, if you had gone into interiors, if you had gone into historic photographs and historic views of this change and that change, we're talking in a book of this length, you would have gotten through a fourth of the homes that are the buildings that you're talking about. So it is such a wonderful kind of reference piece, and the way that it's organized.
Well, thank you.
I think it calls for further investigation.
Yeah, it probably would have gone from a coffee table book to a doorstop book. Yeah. and I don't know that we want to go there.
Exactly. Well, let's jump in and talk about it. And I was saying how I admire how you organized it, the historic buildings book, because we've basically got 7 different sections. And so you give your overview. And I don't know if there's anything else you want to make sure we get in the overview before we move into talking about these categories.
I think we've done a pretty good job. I think we can dive on in.
Houses of worship. You're good Christians, so you put houses of worship first. Possibly because these are the oldest buildings, right?
Yeah. Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
The first building in there is actually the oldest building in Waco, which is St. Paul's Episcopal Church. But we do have buildings in the chapter that are from the early 1960s. So it covers a pretty broad span. And just out of the nature of the sort of data that I was drawing on for this as opposed to historic homes, I was able to push the end date a little later. Mm-hmm. Basically, historic homes, things pretty much ended right at the beginning of World War I, so 1940-41. And with these, it was not, my sources weren't as tied to the U.S. Census, which at the time I was writing historic homes, we had the 1940 census. Now we also have the 1950 census. Mm-hmm. So someone else can hop in there. But it was just a different body of evidence that I was using. So it was easier to spread into the later decades a little more.
It looks like it's about a 50-year, everything in here is kind of at least 50 plus years old.
Scary to think, but yes, that's true.
That's right. There's some stuff from the early 70s, very early 70s.
Right. Yeah. That about finishes it off as 1971, something like that.
Well, I don't want to go entry by entry because I want folks to buy the book. But I'm interested in, as you looked into these houses of worship, maybe some things that stood out to you from the stories of some of these buildings.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting story in that the different congregations of Waco were quite keen to make statements in the landscape of their buildings. And it's probably not surprising that the Episcopalians were first off as far as that. And rather interestingly, they chose an architect not only from out of town, but also from out of state and from New England, a guy by the name of William Pitt Wentworth. In fact, probably the earliest research that I did on this book happened in the spring of 2000, which was right after I had my job interview at Baylor. And my Baylor colleague, Ellie Caston, took me to Sunday service at St. Paul's and gave me a little historical brochure. And it's like, this was designed by a Boston architect, William Pitt Wentworth. And so when I went back for my final several months at Historic Deerfield in Massachusetts, I took a couple trips into Boston, during which time I was able to look up a couple of other churches by Wentworth, including one on Cape Cod and one in Roxbury, Mass, and the like. And so it was interesting comparing what he was doing in Massachusetts as opposed to what he did here. And part of that is that Waco was still a young and unsettled community in 1878, 79. And we don't have any evidence that Wentworth actually came to Waco. So sort of, get to the drawing table and pray to God that the site is flat that you're going to be designing for, or have someone draw a rough sketch. And of course, it's right next to Barron's Creek. So that could have created a bit of a challenge. But it was interesting realizing that even in that very early context, when Waco was not quite 30 years old, that they were actually shipping in the stained glass and some of the fittings, the pulpit and the like, from New York City.
Wow.
And the reason that it's New York rather than Boston is that Wentworth had done what we would call his apprenticeship in New York City, working for an English architect named Henry Dudley, who did Gothic revival churches in the Northeast and also some in the South as well, in Huntsville, Alabama, for example. So he was working for someone who specialized in churches and probably knew the guys who were making the pulpit and the stained glass in their shop in New York City. So I'm finding that more and more interested. I'm getting more and more interested in the sort of construction layer of this, that, you have the architect who creates the beautiful drawings, but somebody's got to make it real. And so just who are these guys and what are they doing, and how did the materials get to Waco and the like. So those issues intrigue me a lot. But another, just to jump to a completely different era, I was fascinated by the story of St. Francis on the Brazos Catholic Church. And really that's a church that's founded specifically because of, first, the Mexican Revolution, the immigration of a lot of people seeking peace and prosperity coming across the border, and many of them settling in Waco, and that the cheapest place to live is the neighborhood formerly known as the Reservation, which rapidly became Calle Dos instead of 2nd Street. So there was very clearly a Spanish-speaking working class group of people who needed to be preached to. And interestingly enough, it was the Franciscan order that was sent to do that, which is probably the reason why there's this strange and interesting story of trying to fashion the church on Mission San Jose in San Antonio. And it's very striking. And this is another area where, if I just had room for one or two more pictures. They're actually in the Roy Lane papers over at the Texas collection at Baylor. There are a couple of sketches that he did early on in this process, because he actually went to San Antonio to study the missions, and most notably Mission San Jose, and that was the inspiration for the earliest example. And the reason I find that so remarkable is that when he took that trip in 1928, San Jose was a ruin. It did not have a roof. It did not have a dome. And so part of what he was doing was studying the ruins. Another thing was studying the historic photographs, sort of like I do or any architectural historian did, of what it used to look like. And so some of his early plans, there was going to be a dome that looked like the one that no longer existed in 1928. So the audacity of what Roy Lane and the parish of St. Francis was doing then is kind of obscured by the fact that in the next 10 years, the building was reconstructed and restored using money from Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And so now it's like, oh, what's the big deal? There's this perfectly fine building standing there, and easy to model that. But it was a different kettle of fish when Roy Lane was doing it. He kind of had to do his own architectural history because there really weren't books on architectural history in Texas. So he was kind of on his own as far as that. But it's interesting too that the drawings show other quotations from San Jose that ended up being value engineered out. In other words, budget cuts came into the fore, so that there was going to be a little projection on the Waco north side that would have a beautiful Baroque window, like what's called Rosa's window, and on the original Mission San Jose. That ended up being taken out. The window was actually applied onto the south side wall, which actually is, you can see it a lot better from Jefferson Street. And so you see a variety of changes. On top of that, inside, there's a barrel vault with a series of stained glass sort of dormer windows, which has nothing to do at all with San Jose. It's just sort of, it's the image of the exterior that Lane was going on recreating. And there's also a whole series of remarkable murals that are painted on the inside. And those, the ones around the altar, were done by a professional Italian painter. He was an Italian professional painter. He wasn't a professional Italian. But who was from, had studied in Rome, came and settled in New Jersey, painted churches up there. So I'm not sure how they made the connection with him, but he ends up coming down, painting the paintings on the altar. At a later date, just after World War II, a painter named Barcelo, who was from the island of Majorca, comes and paints the Stations of the Cross that really dominate the interior of the church. So it's interesting seeing these figures from far, far away, where the altar itself was made in San Antonio by Rodriguez brothers, who had the funerary monument concession, shall we say, on the west side. In fact, that's a business that's still going today. But has a nice little label on its on the side there, and so but at the same time, you had Fred Simon of Waco Artstone providing a lot of the ornamental decoration, and Carl Troutschild, who was just starting out in the woodworking business, provided the altar pews. And so it's actually an extremely well-documented building. And so that makes me very happy when I can look at all the different people who came together to make a building like that possible. So I hope that people will enjoy that sort of story too, because it is a very rich story, and all the different sorts of people who were involved in it. And both Troutschild and Simon were German Catholics, and so I assume that they were going to St. Mary's. Yeah. But so it's interesting, keeping track of that aspect as well.
Yeah, and I would say if there's a building in this book, you need to go in. If you have never been in it, it's a beautiful. St. Francis is a beautiful building.
It's quite remarkable.
That the comment you made earlier that I think is interesting as a historian is, New Hope, St. Francis, even First Baptist. These are kind of markers in time of the community that they served. And then you see Waco kind of shifting and changing around it. Even some of the buildings you're talking about, the purposes of them is changing over time.
Yes,
But, yeah.
definitely. It's interesting seeing the dynamics of that. And, part of what happens in the long run is that a lot of these congregations face the challenges of suburbanization, that's drawing off a lot of people who would be in the congregation. And, and one of the other old phrases is white flight,
Yeah.
that white people are uneasy about the increasing diversity of what becomes known as the inner city. Although, a black friend of mine has pointed out, well, there was black flight too.
Yeah.
And that you see that in some of the historic congregations here, like St. James, where the number of people had dwindled to the point that they really didn't have the ability to raise the funds to take care of what's a very interesting and historic building. And there's a possibility that we may face something like that with New Hope Baptist Church as well. And both of those are quite remarkable buildings. The St. James is another interesting story and has a San Antonio connection as well. It has a very detailed cornerstone to it, and specifically names the architect of the building, and that was Adams and Adams of San Antonio. And they were a pretty well-known architectural firm and had designed the big house at the King Ranch just a few years before. It's like, what? But it turns out that they also did work in San Antonio for St. Paul's Methodist, which is one of the prominent Black congregations on the near east side of San Antonio, which is actually the elder sister of our St. James. Different colored brick, but with the same sort of Tudor Gothic style, the twin octagonal towers in front. And the man who was the contractor for St. Paul's in San Antonio actually ended up moving to Waco and was the contractor for St. James here, which is really interesting to think of. To think of someone like that being involved with two very prominent Black churches here in Texas. So that was a pretty cool aspect as well.
Yeah, and in that process, I like, since you brought your timeline up a little bit, you can also follow that process of suburbanization a little bit with the Methodist on Cobb and even St. Albans, which is pushing out towards Castle Heights and those subdivisions there. Yeah.
Yes, and First Methodist is an interesting story as well. And in fact, the drawings for First Methodist are also in the Alexander Architectural Archive at UT. And I went down to see them, and so the curators there handed it to me and says, "Well, here they are." And the first thing that I saw was that in addition to the drawings for the current church building, there was a blueprint. And I said, "Well, what's this?" "I don't know." We unrolled it, and it was a blueprint for a Gothic revival steeple. And it was the rebuild of the steeple after the tornado of 1953 and signed by Birch D. Easterwood, who had been an architect in Waco since the teens and had designed many Waco houses and many other buildings that showed up in this book, including buildings at Baylor. So he was a busy boy. And sometimes there's confusion that the tornado had destroyed Fifth Street Methodist. And it certainly did significant damage in knocking down its tower. But they stayed in that building for another 10 years. But they were I think it was probably a new generation of the congregation, and that they were quite keen to find a new home that was closer to sort of the new suburban center. And so the move of First Methodist, is coming at the same time that Lake Air is developing.
Yeah.
And so those two are really side by side. And it's remarkable in that the decision was so successful that it actually obscures the original 1962-63 building, because it's a congregation that has continued to grow.
Yeah.
And as a result, the steeple was designed in 1962, although not erected until 1975, 76. But the original worship space is now the children's worship space, and you can barely see. It's very hard to get a sense of that. But there's the large and very impressive space beyond that, and it's good to hold on to the site, and at the same time, you kind of lose touch with some of the early days. But how do you deal with success? Is the issue there, and their education wing has expanded all the way over to Lake Air Drive. So it's just been a remarkable story. And I actually did that was another one where the overall view allows you to get the impressive stainless steel steeple, but you don't see the original entrance with its sort of modern stained glass and the like. So there are times once again where it's like, ooh, 2 pictures would have been really helpful here, but you win some, you lose some. And of course, part of the hope of a book like this is that it will encourage people to get out and see more of Waco, and that there is a lot to see.
Well, I'm realizing I should have done 7 episodes with you on each chapter. We can't.
Really?
We got to keep moving.
Yes.
I mean, one thing putting them together, I think was interesting in churches is how many churches were built in the 20s. I mean, just this window, there's a 10-year period there where most of the churches that you have in here are constructed.
It's a real boom period for Waco, which I think was really very evident in historic homes too. Just how many of those, and the not the creation. Well, I guess it was the creation of Castle Heights, and some of the other neighborhoods that are now historic, but growing quite rapidly. And and you see Baylor really growing at a rapid pace, and you begin to get new and modern dormitories, the old Brooks Hall and Women's Memorial Dormitory, really sort of that work in the 20s and even into the 30s, in spite of the Depression. Baylor is slowly but deliberately building and creating the launching pad for a much larger Baptist university.
Yeah.
So that was one of the interesting aspects of the chapter on colleges. And Birch Easterwood has a breakout in the colleges chapter as well. Although he also did some churches. He did the Liberty Bank building, which is just a little bit up Austin Avenue from the Alico building. So he ends up his role as really basically the official Baylor architect for the colonial revival, from Brooks Dormitory up through and including Pat Neff Hall. He was really quite critical in providing that sort of imagery, which still exists in sort of ghostly memory in more recent buildings.
Do we have his collection? I mean, do we have his papers and things at Texas Collection?
There is not a collection.
Okay.
I have met his grandson, who's a third generation architect.
Oh, wow.
Lives in Fort Worth, and I don't know that. I think a lot of the papers just got thrown away, in spite of the fact that Easterwood, after Pat Neff Hall, ended up moving to Fort Worth, and so his only Baylor building after that was Tidwell Bible Building,
Mm-hmm.
which is another interesting story.
Yeah.
But he did quite a few Baptist churches all around Texas, including the one out in Gatesville. He did the First Baptist Church in Galveston, which is really quite prominent near the Rosenberg Library. Although his association with Baylor really pretty much came to an end, he still had a close association with Baptists elsewhere.
Okay. Well, let's jump in. Commercial buildings. I've already decided, Ken, we're going to do a part 2 of this at some point, but I want to gain a little more ground. If you're willing to come back.
Yeah,
for
sure.
Okay.
Sure.
One of my favorite buildings
Let
that
me
I
talk.
have great hopes for, the Cornish building, which I think is a canvas there that something wonderful could be done.
Mm-hmm.
Many known as the Kestner building on Elm Avenue. And so that leads off your commercial buildings chapter. Talk a little bit about that structure.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty nicely preserved commercial store. Oddly enough, the most important thing I did research-wise in working on that building was to look up and notice that at the very top it says Cornish Building.
Yeah.
And it's like, who the heck is Cornish? It's always been Kestner's.
Yeah.
And that's what it was from, I guess it was 1914 or something like that, 1913. And, but actually I had to dig in and find out who the Cornish family were and what they were doing, and that they had been involved in Waco real estate. And so it was actually built as 2 stores. And so the main change that happened to it was that the party wall in the middle was taken down, a new staircase put in, and a single central door.
Okay.
So, which, as things go, that's really not too bad.
Yeah.
If that's the worst thing that happens to you as a building. Although it also had mezzanine windows, which I love to see them in old-timey Texas stores, where there, oftentimes there's an awning which shades the building from a lot of direct sunlight, but then there'll be a squarish row of windows, that light wafts into the structure. And a lot of times those do get covered over, as has happened in the case of Kestner's. But the one time that I've been inside the building, I noticed that, by golly, those windows are actually still leaning against a wall on the ground floor. So
oh, wow.
there's you can either put them back or fabricate exact duplicates because they are there. But
it's going to take deep pockets, but I hope those windows are restored.
Keep fingers crossed. But that's our oldest commercial building that we have here in Waco.
And then which contrasts some information I received, which is a bit of low-level controversy that you address in the book about Clinton Grocery, that building, because I have heard before that that's the oldest commercial building, but your research says no.
Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable about that it's not that it's super duper old. We're talking 1897 as opposed to 1901. And really, generationally, they're quite close, even to being 2 commercial buildings, 2 commercial spaces set within one store. I think Kestner's probably is a little more exuberantly Victorian than the Clinton building.
So the Clinton Grocery is 600 Elm there on the corner.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, it's very, I'm going to say it's very businesslike. Of course it is, it's for businesses, but businesslike in the sense that it's not wasting a lot of money on, frivolous ornamentation or anything like that. And, sometimes it's fun seeing, I'll use phrases like, this is what Waco looks like when it rolls up its sleeves and get to work. I mean,
that's why you're a published author. It's phrases
absolutely,
like that.
Yeah, those colorful turns of phrases. But like, the building that's was the Percy Medicine building, Baby Percy, which is in here as well, and which has actually changed hands since this was written. So
yeah,
it's my first, my first, and I tried actually to acknowledge the title of each building was as close as I could get to its historic title. And then if there was something that was compelling about a later occupant, I would just put, in parentheses, later.
Like the Texas Fireproof Storage Building,
right,
is a good example of that.
Yes, absolutely.
Now the Balcones.
Yeah, little did you know that you could go get high-end whiskey.
Is it still fireproof? Is the question.
Yeah, boy, imagine that nowadays.
Because there's fuel in there.
And the interesting thing about that building too, and one of the things that, and this gets back to the sort of Waco boom of the 20s, is that that building is linked to someone who built an impressive home that's in Historic Homes of Waco. And so I wanted to do cross references, shout outs, if you will, to the owners of a business. And well, what did they build with that, the profits from their successful business? And so that was certainly the case with the Albaughs. Roy Albaugh was the owner of that building that's now Balcones, and his house is on Colcord at 22nd. Very impressive. So I wanted people to be able to see, okay, well, person built this business, and how did they live? How did the person who swept the floors in their building live? And there will be a few of those in more historic homes. One of the smallest Waco houses I've come across. So that was something that I was keen to emphasize, that even though they're separate books, you get a better understanding oftentimes out of what by bouncing back and forth between the two. Or the 20s was also when the boom was happening with automobiles. There were some autos earlier, but you begin to get auto showrooms being built in Waco, a lot of them on Austin Avenue. You begin to have filling stations, gas stations. Yeah. And so I have a couple in here, and there could very easily have been more. It's kind of surprising when you
well, I love the inclusion of Magnolia filling station.
Yes, rather
include.
Yes, rather, Magnolia, the original name of Mobil back in the day. But yeah, the Merrick Medicine Company was the one that more recently has been the Findery, and so it's very prominently labeled on their awning now. And so I have Merrick Medicine Company, in parentheses later the Findery, and of course it's good to say later rather than now the Findery, because you never know, they might change locations and the like. So capturing a specific moment in Waco's history.
That's right.
When we write this.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, these commercial buildings. So Magnolia gas station is later. It's Mama and Papa Bear's Barbecue, right?
Yes, it is.
Is that did I get the name right?
Yes, and it's a little that one's a little harder to recognize as a gas station because the service bay was infilled, so that's now part of the interior. But and of course we have the Gulf Station that's on Washington Avenue,
which has
been nicely restored.
Yeah, nicely restored.
Yeah, so that's kind of delightful to have that.
I'll ask in this, Ken, did you talk to, I don't know if I asked you this with this, how much engagement you had with the owners of the homes, but some of these are, small, some of these are big companies where you wouldn't have as much access, but like small little buildings like this that we're talking about, did you interact much with the owners?
It really varies. It's kind of dumb luck, which comes out of sometimes I can be introverted and not really wanting to push myself on to people. It's a lot easier to do churches, which tend to be open on a much more regular basis. It really depended on whether there was some way in which we reached out, or someone that I knew someone that they knew, and the like. I wanted to be a little cautious about being too. I didn't want to be too close to the owners necessarily. Yeah. Because, you can kind of make, become an advocate for your house or your
Sure.
building or whatever. So that can be a little tricky as far as that. But at the same time, I've been welcomed by many homeowners and building owners in Waco and seeing what they've done.
Well, none of your commercial buildings descriptions read like an ad, which
Really?
could be a
Not
pull
even-
here, right? You
Not
know?
even for realtors.
Yeah.
So,
Fine food, great service. I mean, it doesn't talk about
yes,
that.
excellent Yelp reviews.
One building I want to talk about before we leave the commercial section, and then I think
Sure.
we'll break for part two. I've always thought Saks Austin Avenue is really interesting and also representative of this phenomenon we were talking about earlier as Waco kind of changes. I see it as kind of the first kind of move out of the commercial district of downtown and talk a little bit about that. And of course, folks don't know it by Saks Austin Avenue.
Right. Yes, exactly. I didn't know it as Saks Austin Avenue until I started writing this. I knew it and still know it as Saronia, named for the Madison Cooper novel. But it had always struck me as being unusual in an unusual design for Waco.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out that it was a company that was actually a refugee from downtown after the 1953 tornado.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was the Saks family, and they had originally been on the square. And so their building was seriously damaged in the tornado. And so they made the huge jump all the way to the 1500 block of Austin. Even before that, there's the La Savio's grocery store, which is that sort of white Art Deco building that's about a block up. And they were originally just off the square, and quite explicitly in 1938-39 said in the newspaper that they were concerned that downtown Waco was getting too congested, and that their customers were finding it difficult to park their cars. And so, it doesn't seem like an insane jump to go from 4th Street to 15th Street. But in fact, one of the big advantages to that was that it was a lot easier to park your car. And back to Saks Fifth Avenue, that was designed, there's actually 2 blocks, and then with that carport in the middle. And so there was a dedicated parking lot that came with that as well. So it's interesting tracking all those ways in which Waco architecture changes to accommodate the automobile, gas stations, showrooms, parking lots, drive-ins for banks. In fact, the old First Federal Savings building, the very high colonial revival First Federal Savings, even has a drive-in window in colonial style.
Yeah.
So it's interesting seeing, Waco embracing modernity, but sometimes wanting to put the tri-corner hat on the top.
Yeah. Now, I know I keep just one more in you, but connected to that group you're talking about is also, I see the elite kind of organized around automobile diners.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was actually the second location of the elite, because the original had been downtown in Austin Avenue. And so,
but I know you made a big contribution here in looking into the designer of that building out on the Circle.
Yeah.
And not much of that had been done. Yeah.
Yeah, I was delightfully surprised to discover that the Oral History Institute had
what was that again?
Yes, the Oral History Institute at Baylor University.
Okay, great. Yeah.
And that they had interviewed the owner of the elite. And I had looked through newspapers and all, looking who was the designer of that building, because it's it makes a statement on the Circle. And by golly, on the interview, not only does he say that it was Herman F. Cason, he spells the guy's last name. So Cason. So, okay, got it, sir. And it was interesting because Cason is really kind of one of the breakout figures in this volume in a way that Bert Easterwood was in Volume 1. I don't think anyone knows who Herman F. Cason was, but he did St. John's Methodist Church.
Okay.
It's at 18th Street and Bosque, which is a very nice neoclassical design. He was in the 30s, worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps and designed the buildings in Mother Neff State Park,
wow.
including changing the water tower into that lookout tower, and the concession pavilion that's now sort of in the flood zone, but a lovely building. So a lot of Waco and Central Texas iconic structures. He was the guy behind the design.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah.
So, yeah. And so in terms of the elite cafe, it was certainly, oriented towards the circle, which it's clear that he saw that as a design challenge, because do you just plop a box? How does a box relate to a circle?
Yeah.
Will it be able to rest? So interestingly enough, he comes up with this idea of an octagonal tower, and that becomes the meeting place of two L's, so that it is actually an angled design. So really, really quite subtle, and successful. And then using the Spanish colonial style, which had become very popular in Waco and in the southern U.S. from California to Florida in the 20s and 30s. And so it's one of the more interesting versions of that here. And by the time you get to the late 90s, or when I came to Waco in 2000, the interior had pretty much gone away. It had been remodeled so many times that, and it had been basically a simple roadside diner. So it was never, they invested all the money on the outside to encourage people to come in. Elvis had left the building and the original interior had left the building. But in the way in which it was adapted to become the Magnolia table, I think it really is pretty appropriate. The most dramatic change that they made was the insertion of the clear story windows on the top of the two wings, which actually sort of echo where the sign saying Elite Cafe had been in neon. So that was kind of subtle. It really lightens and enlivens the space inside, which is, it's a new thing, but, it manages to preserve the exterior character while creating, a pretty successful new interior.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But you can still see its period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you've been generous with your time, so I'm going to make you come back. I'm going to play upon your generosity and make you come back. But listener, do this before part 2 comes out. Go get your copy of Historic Buildings of Waco, Texas, wherever great books are sold. And next time when we do episode 2, you can listen along with us and turn your pages and see the pictures of these structures that we're talking about that are so important. And as Ken and I end, we're looking out the window again to see this panorama of Waco from Rogue Media Studios at the top of the Alico building. So thank you, Dr. Hafertepe, for joining me today.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This has been a Rogue Media Network production.